Good morning, good afternoon, folks. This is Doug Cluck. We'll begin here in, 2 or 3 minutes. We're going to let a couple folks get on, get our numbers up a little bit before we get started here. So stand by. Dennis, just do a quick sound check with you.
Good day, everybody. Today we're starting the September version of the Midwestern Great Plains Climate and Drought Outlook. Lots to talk about today, so let's dive right into it.
Okay, hold on. That's good, Dennis. Hold on now. I was just doing a sound check with you to make sure I could hear you, and we could hear you, I was going to say. So everybody can hear everything now, Dennis. We're live.
Got it.
And you're doing it from your phone, Dennis, not the computer, right?
No, I'm on the computer.
Oh, you are trying to go through the computer? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's hope it's a stable thing.
We usually seem to be pretty good here on the computer audio.
Yeah.
Can't be any worse than Brian's.
We're, well, it was neither one of our fault. People may think it was, and they may actually think we're unstable, the way that sometimes these webinars go. But
well, for anybody who knows us, they know we are unstable. But,
yeah. I'm not even going to look at the chat session because I'm sure people are saying weird things about us. Okay, let's well, it's a couple. Let's wait another minute or two.
Yep.
Oh yeah, it's not even 12 according to. I'm looking at a wall clock and it looks like it's fast. So let's just wait another couple minutes. Good. I hear Paul's writing in to say we sound good. We left off the Nidus logo.
yeah, I used an old slide deck. So
And we need to. Yeah, we also probably ought to update the Drought Mitigation Center. I think they're new.
yeah, that's true. Okay.
Yep. Of course, it's all 20/20 hindsight now. One more minute, Dennis. I wasn't able to send out a reminder this week due to my, I guess, travels or whatever. I just didn't have the bandwidth to do that. So. All right, why don't we go ahead and get started? Looks like we got a fairly stable number of people on board. This is the North Central U.S. Climate and Drought Summary and Outlook, where today Dennis Toddy is going to be, Dennis Toddy from the USDA Ag Hub in Ames, Iowa, Midwest, is going to be giving the overview. Excuse me. We will take questions. Well, you can write questions in the little question area throughout. some of those questions, if I can get to them, we'll answer right away. Other ones we'll just wait till the end because there's usually plenty of time for a Q&A session at the end. I think Dennis has quite a bit to talk about, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Dennis, and I'm going to hit the record button so we don't forget. So take it away.
All right. Good day, everyone. Great to be here with you. It's a lovely day in Ames, Iowa, though a bit humid. Warmth is into the 80s, not unexpected, but dew points in the low 70s, which are a little high for late September. Has been some heavier rains in various places. A couple places in southern Iowa have received more rain in the last 24 hours than they've received all summer before. So kind of an added irony to the end of the growing season down there. So Doug was right. We do have plenty to talk about where we are right now. So let's dive in and get right at it. Again, just a reminder that this is a great collaborative effort across the middle part of the country among a number of different federal and state partners who work quite well together. NOAA, USDA, state climatologists, regional climate centers. It's a good group to work with. And if you ever need more information, talk to your local one or regional one. We'll be happy to get you in contact with people. Our next webinar will be October 19th, where we will have Laura Edwards, my follow-up at South Dakota, who's the South Dakota state climatologist now, along with Brad Rippey from the USDA Office of the Chief Economist. We'll be doing a tag team. Brad will be doing a bit of a wrap-up on the growing season, and Laura will be filling in with an outlook and some other information. So our agenda for today is, again, a kind of review of current conditions, where we are for the summer. Several different impact issues. Last couple of days been lots of email, electronic traffic, and talking amongst different folks about issues related to weather and climate this summer, which are really kind of interesting, and we'll touch on a few of those. And then our outlooks for the rest of the fall and early part of winter, noting that we do have a flavor of La Nina coming up that's going to be coloring our outlooks as we're looking ahead. So let's do a quick look back at where we are over the last 30, 90 days. Here we have from NCEI, NOAA NCEI, statewide average temperature ranks for August, so for the last full month. And again, this is a ranking scale. The darker the blue, the lower on the ranking scale, or colder it was, the brighter the red, the warmest it was. Briefly outside of our area, look on the West Coast, and you see that the West Coast was record warmest for the month of August. In contrast, and you can kind of see what the pattern that was set up would be a ridge of high pressure that we parked over the western part of the U.S., bringing heat to them, while there's been Canadian air coming down out of Canada, which makes sense as it's called Canadian air, that we have cooler temperatures throughout the middle part of the country, with several places top 10 coolest for the month of August, which has had some very interesting impacts related to it, which we'll talk more about. Iowa 8th coolest August, Missouri 7th, Illinois the 10th, but cool throughout the whole middle part of the country here. If you look through the last, the June through August period, same thing for temperature, June through August, you still see a similar pattern with warmer to the west and cooler further to the south in this case, while the upper Midwest was kind of middle of the road. You do see some of the warmth that was impacting the plains earlier on. Again, this is June through August, so we include that early part of the summer, early to mid part of the summer, before the temperatures turned a little bit cooler later on there. We're going to break this down now, the 90-day period, into maximum and minimum temperatures, because this continues to be an interesting issue that we talk about from some longer-term changes, but has some shorter-term impacts. Where we rank on the upper left-hand side, June through August, high temperatures, and where they rank, again on that 1 to 123 scale, and then the statewide minimum temperatures, June through August, and where they rank on that scale. You can see that the maximum temperatures were fairly cool over the eastern part of the Midwest and down to the south, whereas minimum temperatures throughout the whole year were kind of middle of the road overall. So again, shows this this impact of rising minimum temperatures over time, whereas the minimums aren't that cool overall, but the high temperatures were fairly cool overall. Really interesting contrast when you look down further south in the Mississippi Valley there between the two of those. 30-day split, again, shows the same kind of thing. Generally cool overall throughout the region. We've split up maximum and minimum temperatures here again. Warmer in Montana, largely because of the drought issues out there. The plains are very much, during the summertime, have this impact of when you are dry out there, they are warmer than average. When they're wet out there, they're cooler than average. But you see over the rest of the Midwest, fairly cool overall. Looking at precipitation, now we've combined 30 and 90-day precipitation. So August in the upper left-hand side and June through August in the lower right-hand side, and the 30 and 90-day rankings. We're talking about this on the same because there's been increased or great issues with variability throughout the summer in the way of when precipitation is occurring and where it's occurring. Let's start off with the June through August one in the lower right-hand side. As further north in the northern plains, Montana area, second driest on record for June through August, 11th driest for August. So a consistent message there, but a really different picture when you break down the whole summer versus, say, August. So the June through August period in the northern plains, generally on the drier side, 28th to 19th driest. But if you look at August, you can see that we were top 10 to top 20 wettest August. So the northern plains, parts of the northern plains were dry early on and have seen some recovery that shows up here between these two. If you look in the eastern part of the Corn Belt, you see the opposite thing. If you look through the whole summer, around the Great Lakes and Ohio, we're on the wet side. But if you look at what has happened in August, they're top 20 driest in August. So they went the other way, from wet early on to dry later on, whereas the plains were dry and then wet. Really interesting contrast over the whole region from some of these different areas, which played around with some of the issues we're seeing in the way of diseases, in the way of crop growth, a number of things like that. So since we're well into the month here, we're looking at the last 30 days. Percent of normal precipitation over the last 30 days. So this is late August to the 19th of September, and the lines don't show up terribly well here, but here's Iowa right here, South Dakota, Kansas down in this area, and then Ohio, Indiana over here, Michigan. Fairly dry over the whole region over the last 30 days, except for northwest Iowa and parts of the plains, which have, again, started to see some changes in the amount of precipitation. And then the far southeast, kind of right just south of the Ohio Valley, where we've seen some of the precipitation from the remnants of Harvey who moved over the area. But much of the area, below 25% of average precipitation for this time of year. Some of that's okay and manageable late in the season, but it's also bad for some end-of-season crop development. Departure from normal temperatures, most of the southeastern and eastern part of the region ranging from 2 to 4 to even 6 degrees below average down in Kentucky and parts of the eastern Corn Belt, whereas you get out in the plains, we're slightly above to more than 4 to 6 degrees Fahrenheit above. So again, depicting that ridge of high pressure off to the west, and then a trough and cooler temperatures over the eastern part of our region. From a soil moisture standpoint, kind of feeds into the overall issue. This is a summary of several different computer models of soil moisture. Basically, the bluer, the more purple the area, the wetter the soil is compared to average. The scale here is in millimeters, so you have to divide by 25 to get inches. Several inches above average soil moisture south of the Ohio River Valley. Most of the Midwest is at best near average, except for the UP of Michigan. Overall, somewhat drier, and you can see especially in southeast Iowa, several inches below average in the way of soil moisture. And you think of soil moisture, as crops grow, they draw moisture out of the soil, so by the time we reach the end of the season, a lot of the moisture is gone out of our soil profile anyway, and we're even worse than average here because of the dryness conditions. Now, this is valid as of 5 days ago, so there will be some changes that occur because of this, some of the pockets of heavier rainfall that have occurred. We'll talk more about that here in a little bit. From a stream flow standpoint, as of yesterday, this is a 7-day average of stream flow. The areas that are in the brown, again with our typical drought scale, from northern Kansas through southern Iowa, parts of Illinois, and parts of southern Michigan, we have stream flows that are down, on the lower percentile ranking, really showing some of that dryness manifesting itself. In comparison, you've got a few pockets of wetter than average where we've had some rainfall. Some of these areas also are, by the time we reach September, these are typically lower flow times of year, so additional precipitation will manifest itself in higher flows. And then further out into Montana here, fairly low flows also overall. So we pulled that together into where we are with the U.S. Drought Monitor. Just released this morning this week's map. Again, with no surprises here, a large chunk of Montana either in D4 exceptional or D3 extreme drought. Still drought, plenty of drought conditions in the Dakotas, though not as severe as they were earlier, not as severe as in Montana, with most of them being down in the D2, D1 area. Some pockets of severe drought in southern Iowa that will be some of those will be modified next week because of the recent rainfall. This area of southern Iowa really has continued to miss out on precipitation until the last 24 hours, where we've had top 2 or 3 driest summers on record, and that's some really dry summers when you're considering that. Some stations down there having just a few inches of rain this summer, so really very interesting. And then this recent dryness being manifested by small pockets of D1 moderate drought and large areas of D0 abnormally dry. Have to remember, dryness late season, and especially getting to harvest time, is not a bad thing for a lot of people because it allows crops to mature and dry down in the field, which people like to see and get out and harvest. But there is a tipping point where it is too dry, and we've had several places with people asking about, hey, we need some rainfall to start getting our soil moisture recharged, and also fall planted crops such as winter wheat, or people who do cover crops, winter cover crops, do need some moisture to help those germinate. Okay, so that's kind of an assessment of where we are right now. Now we'll go to some of the impact issues that we've seen so far this summer. We've had a number of different areas people reported in that were really quite interesting. From a wildlife standpoint, reports out of South Dakota, North Dakota are big pheasant hunting areas. South Dakota pheasant counts were down 45% from last year, which were down from the year before. So some very low pheasant numbers. The South Dakota Economic Development folks would not like me saying that too loudly, but largely reduced ones, and it sounds like North Dakota are even worse from a pheasant standpoint. Report from the Fort Belknap Reservation in Montana, part of the prairie pothole area where there's ponds and different things where waterfowl are able to reproduce. Those were affected somewhat this year because of the dry conditions starting late spring and into summer, impacted some of the issues there. And then several fish kills in streams in a variety of different places because of low flow, and then you had some kind of a discharge into a low flow that led to fish kills, unfortunately. Let's jump to agriculture now. Probably more to talk about overall. The big issue recently, and why we put out a release with our NOAA friends a couple weeks ago, was because of late developing corn crop, and we show this here in a couple of these different maps. This is corn progress, where we are as of Monday, is the report. On the lower right-hand side, it's the percent that is mature, which is considered it's reached a point where it is mature. Frost would not, or freeze would not do damage to it anymore. But the number on the top for each state is the percent that is mature. The number on the bottom is how far behind the 5-year average it is, and you can see the overall compared to the 5-year average for all the U.S., 13% behind. But we have several states, including South Dakota, Minnesota, and Illinois, are 20 or more % behind average being mature, and then several that are in the teens. So we have a lot of corn that still needs some more time to mature before it's safe from a frost freeze. That's been a big issue, and there was some discussion about early frost or freeze conditions. Those did really not manifest themselves. We'll talk about that more here in just a second. But you know, it's a continuing thing that people are going to be watching. It does not look like it's going to be a major issue, but there does need to be some more time before we reach a freeze to allow corn to reach its maturity. The map in the upper left-hand side is the % harvested. We are starting to see some harvest activity. It's still a little bit early for that yet, but we are behind the 5-year average also in that. From a soybean perspective, soybeans don't react the way corn does. Corn needs a certain amount of heat to get it all the way through its growth progress. Soybeans are sensitive to photoperiods, so they realize the days are getting shorter and they start to wrap up their growth, their phenology. But even from a soybean perspective, the % that are dropping leaves as of Monday are, you know, you see several states here that are double digits behind, which is they've lost quite a bit of ground over the last couple weeks too. So we need some more time for them. There is more progress, it appears, in harvesting soybeans than there has been in the way of corn in various places, but they also need some more time for soybeans to mature. The other issue for both of these is that not only do they need some time to mature, they need some time to dry down in the fields. Commodity prices for both of them are fairly low, so there's limited profit margins, and people don't want to be drying the grain any more than they need to because that cuts more into their profit margins. Also, heard from Nebraska and South Dakota, some issues with white mold popping up in some of the soybeans. While we're talking about freeze, let's just take a quick diversion here, and we talked about some of the freeze timing and how much time we need for this to happen. Here is a map of the median first fall 28 Fahrenheit, which we considered a hard freeze, the one that will the temperature that would probably end the season for corn and soybeans. Other crops, horticultural crops, types of things would likely be impacted at 32 or even sometimes higher, depending on the crop and its condition. But so we'll just focus on the 28 for right now. And when this actually occurs, the median that, there's a wide, again, distribution about a week or 10 days around that for most of the dates. But you can see that the first 10 days of October is about the median time for that across most of the north part of our region. We get down to the middle of October, a little bit further south, and then as we get down to the southern parts of our region, we're getting down to the latter part of October. If that freeze date does reach that point, which I think it still has a good chance of reaching that, we should be in pretty good shape. People are wanting as long as possible before we hit the freeze, but we should be I think, in pretty good shape that way. So just some issues related to this. Frost has occurred already in a few places. You know, Minnesota, Michigan, even parts of the western Dakotas down to Nebraska. Most of these were in areas that are susceptible to early season freezes because of being farther north. Most of the reports are that there was really minimal issue with that, no real problem. The only problem we did hear from the cold temperatures overall was from Mary Knapp in Kansas mentioning that sorghum, the cooler temperatures are really limiting sorghum, and they need some additional heat to wrap up the season for it. Again, lots of concerns because there were some late planted crops and delayed crops because of that extended cool period the latter part of the summer. That cool period the latter part of the summer was very pleasant for most people and livestock, but for crops they needed some more heat to kind of move their season along. There's really no near-term chances for very cold temperatures that cause frost and freeze. Computer models are kind of bouncing around as to when they bring that in. It does look like as we get into the first or second week of October, there's a better chance of some cold coming, but that's still a bit far out to be able to say too much about when and where and how severe the cold will be. Likely it looks like a fairly limited issue for crops as it appears right now, as we're starting to wind down our season. Pastor? Yes.
Yeah, Dennis, don't mean to interrupt, but there are maps to sort of follow along, and maybe you could go back a slide or two So if people, I don't, do you have a URL in there where those frost freeze maps are on the Midwestern Regional Climate Center site?
I failed to do that. You can search, well, these come out of what's called the Vegetation Impact Program, so you can search MRCC VIP, and that will take you right to that.
MRCC VIP, and you're interested in following if you will, the progression of 32 and 28. I think they have a couple different temperature regimes to follow the progress of that as the fall. And they also do it in the spring to watch for last freezes and things like that. Sorry about that. Carry on.
No, what Doug is referring to is, I didn't include those maps, but they have on this same site. This is the 30-year period from 1980 to 2010, but they also have where temperatures have fallen below 32 and 28 so far this year on this same site. So it's a good, that I should have included that. That would have been a good map to show the locations that did do that. So good thoughts about that. Okay, other ag issues, pasture and range conditions, where pasture and range are showing the most problems. Again, out in the plains, Montana, and out of our area, but in the Northwest, really very poor. This is the percent that's called good to excellent. Very, very small amounts that are good to excellent. Very large amounts which are very poor, and I didn't choose to include those right now. There have been some interesting late season issues. I mentioned some heavier rainfalls in southern Iowa here that were this morning, 6+ inches in a few places in southeast Iowa. Up here, this was from eastern North Dakota, close to 6 inches in eastern North Dakota. There was a picture somebody posted on Twitter of corn that was in a fair amount of water because of the heavy rainfall that occurred in these areas. Again, too late. This is too late to help the crop out, and actually could be detrimental, especially if it makes the field too wet to get into, because you could have some issues with compacting soils by going in some of the wetter conditions. Some very interesting issues from other crops. Several extension folks over the last couple days had mentioned that pumpkins were 1 to 3 weeks early in Indiana and Iowa, and nobody's really quite sure exactly why that happened. Because pumpkins are annuals, they're planted every year. We did have some discussions last week that that perennials, things that are perennial, are ahead of annuals this year because the warm early spring pushed the perennials along to early development. Annuals were slower, they were planted later because of the cold, and they're behind average, whereas the perennials are ahead of average. So we're kind of trying to figure out why this happened with pumpkins. Also some early apples in Michigan, and reports of some quality issues in Iowa because of the warm overnight temperatures. They're still okay, just a few taste issues. There was a report this morning from Michigan on some storage concerns because of the warm apples that are being harvested right now. Also another interesting report out of Wyoming that there was an area where they grow dry beans that aborted prematurely. The beans did not fill, and the theory was because of the smoky conditions out there, that may have confused the plant into thinking that it was later in the season than it was, and that it aborted the beans before it was before that filled out. A few other small comments were winter wheat planting, places in the plains and in the eastern part of our region that do plant winter wheat that is planted in the fall and then goes dormant. Because of the dry conditions, and mentioned in Nebraska, because of this extended fall period, people have been a little reluctant to start planting that just yet because they want to see some moisture. And also people who do cover crops, those crops that go on to help protect the soil after the regular crop, there's been some issues with those getting established because of dry soil conditions. Jumping onto the other big one for the summer is fire and smoke. As of right now, most of the large fire issues are at the far western edge of our area in Montana and then along the west coast. They haven't received as much attention because of the issues in the hurricanes out east, but there's still plenty of fires going on. We've seen the impacts of those over the summer, mainly because of the smoky, hazy conditions when we've had the right atmospheric conditions bringing things over us. Mostly, some in the Dakotas, but mostly confined to Montana with the dry conditions. Smoke plumes, I mentioned, have limited solar radiation and visibility at times, even to the point of being able to smell the smoke sometimes, despite the distance that they've come. There were several air quality alert days in several places because of the impaired air quality, and I mentioned some of the dry bean issues potentially in Wyoming. This was an image I pulled. This was one of the days, at the end of Labor Day weekend, showing one of the smoke plumes that was right over the middle part of our region. Looked like cloud cover, but really was a smoke plume that was impacting things. Okay, one more thing on water. Didn't address this too much last month. One of the issues with water, Kansas City had some very heavy rainfall, some record rainfalls late July, led to some flooding in some areas around there. The heavy rainfall in Iowa and North Dakota over the last couple days has led to some flooding of fields, not as much in the way of streams because the streams were fairly low already. Reports from Kevin Lau, the Missouri River, there are a few tributary areas that could be susceptible to some flooding in the fall, but really no major issues. And the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is expecting to have water on the reservoir system back to full flood control by spring, as they're able to go ahead and draw things down. Okay, so we wrapped up some of the impacts. Let's go ahead to the main topic in the outlook, and then we'll address what NOAA is saying in the outlooks overall. We have really mentioned nothing about La Nina last month, and that's because as of a month ago, there really wasn't a whole lot to talk about. But we're going to show you a couple loops of sea surface temperatures. The one on the upper left-hand side is kind of like you're looking down on the Pacific Ocean, Australia on the left-hand side, South America on the right-hand side, and this goes from late June until this is a couple weeks ago now, where you see the blue developing that there was nothing really odd about sea surface temperatures until the last couple frames in that there becomes colder than average water that starts to appear there, which would indicate hinting towards La Nina conditions. On the lower right-hand side, this is a view like you were looking from Antarctica up towards the equator. And then, so it's depth on the left-hand side, and then across the ocean on the top there, you can see with depth there is some colder water, colder than average water at depth, giving some support to that we may be heading to La Nina conditions. And it's really rapidly developed in the last month or so. The computer models did not pick up on this. We did not expect to see something like this happening. So if we go ahead to the outlooks, let's go ahead and talk about what the outlooks are going to mean to us. What has shifted now with the outlooks are that La Nina looks like the most likely outcome of our three possibilities: La Nina, El Nino, and neutral conditions. The blue bars are indicating La Nina is the most likely condition as we're getting out into even September, October, November, all through the winter until February, March, April. That La Nina is the most likely possibility, with at the peak at about a 60% probability of being in La Nina conditions. Very, very unlikely that we're going to get an El Nino this winter. So that is what's driving most of the outlooks. Again, still it's only 60% probability, so it's not guaranteed we're going to see a La Nina. The strength of that potential La Nina is also at question. A number of the models vary from just marginal La Nina conditions to moderately strong ones, so there's not good consensus as to how strong this one will be. Therefore, we're kind of waffling as to what the outlooks are going to mean to us. And also, even with La Nina condition, there's multiple other factors at play that can influence how La Nina influences us. So, and then the likelihood, if La Nina does occur, as we get back to neutral conditions during the spring of 2018. So looking at our next 7 days, you can see a very pronounced area of potential rainfall over the plains up into Minnesota, with 4 to 5 inches possible, isolated 4 to 5 inch amounts possible. Not everyone is going to get all this, but there's a plume of moisture that is over this area that had led to the rainfall in North Dakota. Chances here with some additional heavier rainfall over the next 7 days. As we jump ahead of the 8 to 14 day time period, we're getting into the first part of October. We do see a pattern shift coming, with most of our region either being normal or to better chances for cooler than average conditions. Even at this time of year, cooler than average conditions in the southern part of our region increases your chance for frost a little bit, but still has a good chance of staying above freezing. But the other issue, especially in our driest areas, below average chances for precipitation. After this next week or so, chances for precip kind of fall off and we stay dry. During harvest season, again, dry is not necessarily a bad thing, but it is if you are in a situation where your soils are too dry, or you do have a fall plant of something that you need to get some moisture to. It also can be a problem with fire activity during harvest, with very dry conditions. That anywhere in the Midwest can be potential fire issues during that period. That dry area stays with us throughout the month of October, with better probabilities for being below average in the way of precipitation throughout the month. So if you are dry right now, good chance we stay that way for a better part of the next 30 days. So good and bad related to that. Probabilities for temperature above average for most of our northern area, a slight chance for our northern area, but further west have better chances of being warmer than average. Jump to the 90-day, and we start to take on some La Nina-ish look to our outlooks. That dry area starts to recede somewhat, and we get to EC equal chances. Even with La Nina, our probabilities for understanding precipitation are not very good. From the temperature standpoint, you see that little area of white that starts to appear over the northern plains, and that gradually grows as we go along throughout the winter. And actually, let's go ahead and go to the next one, where we go to December through February with the La Nina. Notice nowhere, I don't think, does CPC put in a below average chances for temperature, but they are saying mostly equal chances for below or above average, because you're balancing this trend towards warmer winters with La Nina conditions, which tend to be a little bit cooler, or have a little better probability of being cooler. And then the precipitation takes on a very La Nina-ish like look, with the Ohio Valley Great Lakes in above average chances for precipitation, and the upper Missouri Basin, northern Rockies in above average chances for precipitation too. We will have to watch closely how these manifest themselves as we go along, but using previous La Nina composites, that's what drives what they're putting in the outlook here. And then I did include the drought outlook through December, with some likelihood of drought continuing in the northern plains. That could be modified by what happens in the way of precipitation here. This area in eastern Iowa will be modified by the rainfall that did occur this last week. So, kind of a summary of where we are from a condition standpoint. Overall, summer was pretty cool over most of the region. Somewhat warmer further out west. Particularly the latter part of the summer was the coolest. Dry west and parts of the central corn belt. There was some recovery in the latter part of the season. We did have a flip in the eastern part of the basin, where they were wet early and turned dry later. From an ag crop perspective, there have been some delays. The perennials, I mentioned ahead, were often ahead of average, like the apples, but the some of the annuals were later. So it's an interesting issue we've had with the way the temperatures panned out this year. Some wildlife impacts on pheasants, some fish, also some reports on some deer issues, and then fires were very bad in a number, and still ongoing in a number of areas. Most of our area has been impacted by some of the smoke and haze from them. Looking ahead, we are in officially a La Nina watch. As of last week, NOAA put us into a La Nina watch, which means that we'll have to continue to watch for development of La Nina conditions, and that is largely what is impacting how the outlooks. Looks more likely in the early winter, about a 60% probability there. From a near-term standpoint, doesn't look like frost impact is going to be too great. The recent warm temperatures are helping to push crops to finish their development, and we don't see too soon in the way of frost freeze conditions. We will continue to watch this if there's any big changes. This dryness is going to continue to the fall. Okay for harvest, but bad for soil moisture recharge and for fall planting. And then this La Nina-like winter outlook. Less warmth likely the further northward you are, and better chances in the northwest part of our region and the Ohio Valley. Okay, lots of partners again who contribute to this, and we can take any questions that you have right now.
Thank you, Dennis. Yeah, if anybody has any questions that they want to slip in there in the question part, or we can try to raise hands and see if I can hopefully see if you're asking a question. Either way, I got to scan through here to see who's raising hands. So it's easier if you just put a question in the question area, or ask questions to ask questions that way. The other thing I'll mention is, you know, Dennis covered the La Nina very well. La Nina tends to manifest itself. There's a bunch of caveats with what I'm going to say, and I'll get to that, but tends to manifest itself as in the northwest part of the country. It tends to be a little wetter than normal, and that, as you can see, through Montana as well as the Great Lakes Ohio Basin, tend to have wetter conditions, mainly in the winter season. That's the strongest connection. In terms of temperatures, as Dennis also said, temperatures tend to average nearer normal or slightly cooler, and this is a general, it's not the prediction this year. So it's just the opposite of El Nino and what you would expect from that. So the big caveats are, if you remember back to 2011 and 2012 were both La Nina years, but the way they sort of, if you will, appeared across the middle part of the country were somewhat different. One year we had an incredible amount of moisture, especially up in Montana, and the next year we had a very big drought. Now, one might argue that the La Nina doesn't play a big part that time of the year in the warm season, and is more of a winter season, just like El Nino, more of a winter season impact. So those are things to keep in mind. There's a lot of variability, of course. So let's go to the questions real quick. Benjamin Diamond asked the first question early on, Dennis, and I told him about climate change and trend and all that, and hopefully you saw that answer. But if you had anything else to add to what are the causes of rising minimum temperatures over time, would you want to say anything else?
I mean, there is a little bit. There would be a little bit of effect from increased CO2, because CO2 being a greenhouse gas would help to keep overnight temperatures up. Really, Doug is right that this seems to be an impact of increased moisture in the region in the summer and other parts of the year that really don't allow temperatures to drop very much at nighttime. You have to have clearer, drier conditions at night for temperatures to cool off. And that's become more of an issue. So what you're seeing, if you look at long-term trends in summertime temperatures, especially in the middle part of the country, the minimum temperatures are increasing. Daytime highs, the trend is flat or actually decreasing in some areas as that daytime temperature range becomes smaller. It kind of becomes crunched because of the flat or decreasing minimums, or flat or decreasing maximums and increasing minimums.
Just to follow up on that, and I'm not skipping you who are not who have other questions in the middle here, but Benjamin also wonders why is there increasing moisture in the air?
We're not sure. There's a fair amount of work being done on that. At least in this region, it's thought to be related to increased transport from the Gulf of Mexico. A warmer Gulf of Mexico evaporates more water in the atmosphere, and then more transport of that here. Certain times of the year and different locations We have impacted it by our cropping development. As you go further out into the northern plains, regions that have shifted from grasses to small grains to corn and beans. Corn and beans grow into the mid-late summer, unlike grasses and small grains. The small grains, we're talking about wheats or barleys or oats or things like that. So you have plants that are transpiring decent amounts of moisture well into the season. That has increased the amount of moisture available in the more moisture in the atmosphere because of crop water use later in the season, different from the way it used to be.
I believe also the main reason, I think, is the first one you pointed out, is that with a warming world, it is a lot easier to have moisture, more moisture evaporated into the air from major water bodies and such. So there is simply more moisture in the air because warmer air temperatures can carry a lot more moisture in them. And now, can you go back one slide? I think Mary wanted to get some information.
Sure
on the
can.
last one. I think that's what she wanted. If not, Mary, let me know. Justin is asking, with a return to neutral conditions next spring, any thoughts on trends for agricultural production, crop and rangeland in 2018? And the first thing I'll say before Dennis says anything is there's no guarantee we'll go back to neutral. That's pretty far out for any predictions with us. You know, the whole El Nino La Nina cycle it is a cycle. It tends to go from one to the other with some sort of middle, as we say, neutral position, but there's no guarantee that'll happen. But with neutral conditions next spring, Dennis, any thoughts?
Well, okay, so focusing on the things that we know about. If we're looking from a rangeland perspective, a bad year in rangeland tends to remanifest itself unless you get very good rainfall the next year, because you don't put as much moisture, you don't get as much carbohydrate buildup into rangeland. You know, unless you get a really good rainfall year next year, you know, we have a better chance of having a poor growing season, or a poor rangeland year, especially in the Montana, eastern Dakotas area. So we know that. Areas of the crop growing areas, we start to focus now on soil moisture recharge. We don't want heavy rainfalls before we start harvesting, but we do need to get some moisture in the soils. So we have to start watching, are we getting some soil moisture recharge? If we don't get that soil moisture recharge and you have dry soils that continue into next growing season, then you do have an increased risk or an increased need to have at least average rainfall, if not above average rainfall, to have a good growing season. So we have to watch for what happens now in the way of soil moisture recharge.
All right. Are individual snowstorms any bigger with La Nina conditions in terms of snowfall or wider swath during, as I said, La Nina conditions overall? Even if it is dry, even if it's a drier than normal winter in the Central Plains, and I'm not sure the answer to that. Dennis can take a swipe at it, but as we said earlier, La Nina years tend to have more cold air to work with. So if you have more cold air around, in other words, less than 32 degrees, obviously you could have more snowstorms. And I don't know if anybody's ever done that sort of correlation.
There's probably been work done on that. It's very difficult to talk about individual events during El Nino or La Nina conditions. All you're doing.
No, but I think he's asking generally.
Yeah.
Well, he's saying, when snowstorms do happen, do they happen to have more snow, and are they broader? And I don't know if there's any correlation there. Okay. I guess next is there any way to predict the amount of snowfall we can predict for the winter, this winter, in the Rockies and upper Great Plains for runoff into the Missouri River? Is there any way to predict that now, the amount of snowfall and thus, if you will, runoff into the Missouri. Do you want me to start with that, or do you want to do it, Dennis?
I'll let you stick your neck out first, and then I'll kibitz around you.
So the question was there any way? And what I would say, there are certain indications with La Nina that you would say the northern Rocky Mountains would tend to have a greater snowpack based upon La Nina than El Nino. Now, last year, I think we had a neutral condition, so we had neither La Nina or El Nino, and the amount of snowfall that we had in Wyoming was record-breaking in some of the mountains, some of the mountain chains anyway, where it was seen as 200 or 300% of normal. Generally, though, it was near normal to slightly above normal in a lot of areas, and I think Colorado was also above normal for the most part. Now, it was a neutral year, so, you know, La Nina years, it depends on who you talk to, but generally the northern Rockies tend to get a little bit more snow, and then the southern Rockies, where it tends to be drier and warmer, if that helps at all. And in terms of the Great Plains, that's a tough one to say. You know, the mountains are a lot easier to sort of deal with when it comes to broad precipitation categories than it is in the plains.
The outlooks do lean towards having above average precipitation chances into the plains.
Yeah, that's, and again, we're talking probabilities here, and there's no for sure's. Diane asks, did the hurricanes cause this pattern shift? Is there any, in other words, is there any implication for all the hurricanes that we're having to anything going on around here in the northern U.S.?
Well, there was not as much in the plains area directly. There was some of the remnants of Harvey that did move through just south of the Ohio Valley and brought some decent rains to Kentucky. And it fairly heavy. I think there was as much as 6 inches of rainfall, but there was minor flooding at worst, so it really wasn't too bad. The main thing that these do is because they're slow moving, they do tend to help slow down a pattern, so whatever pattern you're in, you kind of stay there. But most of these have been farther east. Harvey was the only one that was closer to us. So I guess I would say not a major impact, especially for the northern plains.
Right. And Jamie Trigstad asked if the website was correct that someone passed out, and I don't know. And I think we were trying to share the VIP frost freeze impact thing there. Nonetheless, you can still Google it. The best way. Oh, wait a minute. Oh, the CRH rock. Okay, never mind. Had nothing to do with that. So that is for questions, Jamie. If you want, if you have a weather-related question, something in the next, 1 to 7 days, you can write to those folks, and they'll try to answer your questions for you. Otherwise, if you want general weather information, you can just go to weather.gov, G-O-V, and you can click on your location, get the next 7 days. You can get incredible amount of information off of that website, as a matter of fact, if you're interested in sort of the next 7-day information. I think that is all the questions. Let me just make sure. At the moment, that's all the questions that we have. Dennis, I don't know if you want to say any more about the drought in Montana and the northern plains at all, in terms of its severity. And we have this outlook that goes out a season, and to be honest with you, I wouldn't put a lot of credence in it. And I know that we publish it, and we do it. We do our best to sort of quantify, and you actually go back and show that map, Dennis, if you will. But it's very hard, very, very hard to say where drought will appear and where it won't appear, especially for an entire season out. I would recommend watching the monthly outlook, which is also on the web page. If you go to CPC, NOAA, you could Google again, NOAA CPC, Climate Prediction Center. You can look at all those maps in real time, if you will, and you know, you can look at a lot of things there.
The premise behind this is basically that you have been dry for the year. You're entering the fall. Climatology during this time of year is not for very much precipitation. So if you're not going to get very much precipitation, it's hard to change your drought condition without getting much precipitation. You know, in this area, even if you're above average, it's still not a large amount. So that's why they've kind of painted that whole area as continuing. It doesn't mean that it can't, but it means that it's really not that likely to change things very much. The better places for chances to change things would be, you know, some of these areas that are going to get some near-term precipitation, but then the area that does show drought development is based on regions that are probably somewhat dry to begin with, and if assuming that the CPC outlooks at 30 and 90 days are on the dry side and correct, then you would see some development in these regions. That's basically what they're trying to do there, is take current conditions, what do the outlooks say, what does climatology say? Because if we were looking at this in the northern plains in the spring, even average precipitation in the northern plains in the spring would probably bring us some improvement, because we tend to have more precipitation that time of year.
Yep. That's right. So we're entering, unless you're in the mountains, you're in the north. Unless you're near or in the mountains, you are probably entering a drier time of year, no matter, pretty much no matter where you are, unless you're on the west coast. But in this section of the world, you know, the bulk of our rainfall and precipitation usually comes, you know, April, May, June, July, August. So. Okay, well, I think that pretty much wraps it up for this month. We'll be back next month. Please come and, of course, share with us any questions or ideas or improvements that we might be able to provide you in the future. We're always interested in your opinions and constructive feedback. So thank you very much, and talk to you next month. Thank you, Dennis.
Happy to do it, everybody. Have a good month.